I wasn't really going to do this, but I think it's time to give you some insight into civil and criminal jurisdictions. Civil jurisdictions is where someone has policies, procedures, and protocols, legislation, and everything else to abide by, and there is no criminality involved in it. And it comes down to monetary value and stuff like that. Now, when you use that civil jurisdiction, you can use it both ways. You can use it for the purpose that it was set up for, which is following policies, procedure, protocol, legislation, and adhering to people's rights, because people have rights under it. Or you can twist it the other way and commit the crimes and violate and rape people's lives and invent injuries and abuse, harass, criminally harass, stalk and slander and label and defame your victims. And literally go out to stalk with private investigators and claim the victim is faking their injuries or something like that. This is what ACC does all the time. And they're not actually investigating the injuries. What they're actually doing is inventing their own injuries so they can attack the victim's sanity, so they can have complete control of the victim's life and fate. That's when it becomes a slave trade. That's when it becomes organized crime. That's when it becomes lynch mobs. That's when it becomes that people are being paid to commit crimes against other people. Now, when you go through all those processes of abuse and violence, and they're instigating fear and violence into the case at the same time, those are violent acts against their victims. The intent is to provoke, intimidate, bully, abuse, frustrate, and never to answer a question, never to let a victim get any closure of any kind. Everything they do is to remain in control, and that's what these lawyers do because they're criminals. Now, after they've done all these lines of attack and they haven't achieved their agenda, they still destroyed, in my case, 20 years of my life. And they're still in control because the government literally set up a slave trade. And now they want to turn their crimes they committed behind their civil jurisdiction that they were never held criminally to account for and were never answerable for and never answered the questions, and no one investigated the criminalities behind their actions. And now they want to turn that into civil matters. So what they do is they use the civil jurisdiction to commit the crimes. Then they try and turn their crimes into civil matters, and no one gets held criminally to account, and they remain in control at all times. It is the biggest organised crime run industry in New Zealand. And the New Zealand government are guilty of running a slave trade. The New Zealand government are guilty of misfeasance in public office. Because once they abuse their positions in power and legislation and law against their victims and create all these conflicts, because that's their best line of attacks. So they create all these conflicts and then they involve all these different people into the victim's life. And then it's the victim left to deal with all their shit and all their lies, innuendo, speculation, manufacturing, assumptions, and all the rest of their bullshit. And these were all done to my life through criminal intent to do so. And now the government and the terrorists involved, even though I entered agreements with them, reneged on their agreements, which created another criminally blackmailing holding to ransom situation, which created more criminal blackmail under Section B of the Crimes Act, which enabled them to carry out more fraud and more fraud and more fraud in my case and my life, and still remain in complete control. Now they want to turn their criminalities into criminally blackmailing under Section B of the Crimes Act actions, take public-private criminal prosecutions or sue them. So the government is literally charging the victims millions of dollars while they commit their crimes against their victims. And then they're committing more crimes on top of that, using their corrupt processes of the justice system and the courts. Now, I never realised that the courts were actually set up to commit crimes against people, but now I do realise it. New Zealand is the filthiest, dirtiest, underhand, low-life run country of gangsters and mafia bosses, of fraudsters, of violators and rapists of victims' lives that I have ever come across. And so that's why you end up with last resort people, because New Zealand runs a slave trade, and what they're handing their victims in the process of them trying to get rid of their victims for free and save money and destroy their victims' lives and never address the victims' injuries, it's actually murderous on all their parts of what they've done in this case. And that's why you end up with last resorts, because the entire justice system of New Zealand is run by the biggest gangsters on the planet, and that goes for judges, lawyers, ombudsmen, commissioners, cabinet of ministers and prime ministers. And it makes me sick to the back teeth when I watch Jacinda Ardern coming out and bumming up New Zealand for what a democracy it is and blah blah blah, and all the propaganda their media put out that they're the least corrupt country in the world. They are the most corrupt country in the world, more so over their own citizens. It's bloody ridiculous, and the media help cover up all their crimes. What they do is they destroy people's lives and say they're running a rehabilitation organisation, when in actual fact they're running a slave trade. They're running civil jurisdictions, and they're committing more crimes behind their civil jurisdictions than anything else. They're employing people to write up fictitious reports. They're sending victims' lives down paths they should never go. And this is how your civil jurisdictions work. Now, the review and appeal process that they give you is only there to deal with legislative matters. And firstly, the review process before you get to appeal is the most corrupt system you'll ever come across. Everybody involved in it is criminals. They single out whoever they like, and they throw out the cases that they want to give a hard time to, or they want to tie up for a year or 2 years or 3 years or 4 years or 5 years at a time. That is premeditated criminal intent on the part of all these people involved, and they literally act corruptly at all times. They don't adhere to the Code of Claimants' Rights that you're supposed to have. That was set up by Helen Clark and Ruth Dyson and all the shysters in cabinet at that time. And but it doesn't give you any rights. It's just a farce to show to the United Nations, oh, we did this, but they actually don't adhere to it, and nobody can get held to account for it when they don't adhere to it. So you're literally always left at the behest of their courts, but it takes years to get it resolved, and it's only one issue at a time. So I think I've been into appeal now, what, 5-6 times, and I don't think I've ever lost one lawfully. They try to throw out my appeals because they're as corrupt as the day is long, and this is all part and parcel of the declared act of war against me in my life in this case. And that's why we're at the last resort. But I want to let you know that just because you've got a civil jurisdiction doesn't mean it's used for civil purposes, because my case proves it's used for criminal purposes, and they abuse the legislation they have, they abuse the power they have, they abuse the standover tactics that they can do to their victims. They single out their victims, they isolate them, they alienate them, they back them into a corner, they look to criminally provoke at all times. There is no laws of criminal entrapment for New Zealand, like I said before, because the entire system is built on victimization. New Zealand is the most victimization you'll ever come across. And the people involved in it, if you had enough money, and believe you me, you would need tens of millions, you could put even the prime ministers behind bars for misfeasance in public office, because they're not serving and protecting anybody, nor are the police. They're not protecting people's rights, nor are the police, nor are the criminal law office, nor are the courts themselves. They're manipulating every rule of law so they can literally do whatever the fuck they like and get away with it. And then the onus is left on the victim to fund whatever it costs to take them on while they're funding their own actions with taxpayers' money. And so literally they're funding their own criminalities. And they're not held to a higher standard than society. They're held to the lowest standard you'd ever see in your entire life. Because New Zealand is run by the biggest criminals you'll ever find. Seriously. And they're only there to line their own pockets. They don't give a shit who they get killed or who they don't get killed. They don't give a shit who they harm, who they don't harm. Anybody standing in their way, they're going to walk right through them. And they're going to pay people to threaten and intimidate and bully and abuse and violate and rape people's lives, to have them kidnapped, to have them set up for crimes, to look for their entrapments and everything else. That's what these animals are all about, because they're the biggest fucking terrorists on the planet. And if my case ends up in last resort, like I said before, then every last one of them in Parliament is going to be fucking held criminally to account for murderous actions. It's as simple as that. These are the people causing the problems. These are the people committing the murders. These are the people turning people, their victims, into having no rights to defend yourself and literally trying to turn their victims into murderers, because that's exactly all they're trying to do in these cases. And it's that's the issues that need to be addressed. Nobody wants to address the hard points. Nobody wants to address the hard issues, because then you open it up to discussion, then you open it up to debate, then you open it up to putting facts on the table of what these people actually do. They're not even people, they're creatures. What these creatures actually do to their victims. And they do it day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, under a slave trade ownership action. Now, if you can call New Zealand a democracy running its country like that against its most vulnerable injured people, then it's not just the likes of Saddam Hussein who destroy people's lives, or Osama bin Laden, or all these Western leaders, or I don't know, New Zealand's not Western, but I suppose they are Western leaders. But this is what they do to their victims' lives. And they claim to the fucking world they're the most upstanding, law-abiding, kind, caring fucking people on the planet, when they really don't give a shit. Because they're leaving the onus on the victims while they get away with committing their crimes. And then it becomes the biggest Mexican standoff, criminally blackmailing, criminally holding to ransom situation, and they want it all addressed through their corrupt kangaroo court system. That you can't trust any of their judges, you can't trust any of their politicians, you can't trust any of their commissioners, you can't trust any of their crown lawyers, you can't trust any defense lawyers even, because they're all getting paid from each other to fuck over every victim that they can. The ombudsmen are the worst. And yeah, literally, they're paying each other to fuck over every victim they can, and they're spending millions lining each other's pockets to do it, and putting themselves, the criminals themselves, they're moving into better positions and higher positions so they control the outcome of their victims' lives and fate. And that's where the whole problem is. And the world is not looking at the slave trade industry that New Zealand runs, or the lack of laws that are there to protect society. And the Justice Minister, he lied through his teeth to the United Nations. His excuses, the justice system is broken. No, they don't give people rights and laws to protect themselves. They don't give people laws that the police will actually protect the victims. When government and its administrations and organizations are committing the crimes against its victims from behind its civil jurisdictions, then the victims are fucked. They're never being protected, they're never being assisted, they're never being helped, they're never being supported. They're literally having their lives turned into an ownership slave trade. And that in itself, and the harm and the damage and the frustration and the torment and the torture that they put their victims through, is misfeasance in public office. And no one can argue those facts. Not even the fucking Queen herself could argue those facts. Now, you could walk into a court, you could put all the facts on the table, But because the court system is so corrupt, these people will get, they've got a different law for themselves and another law for everybody else. Now, if anybody kidnapped any other victim, the way they kidnap their victims, just with a pen, just with the writing of a pen, that's how they rob their banks. That's how they carry out their kidnapping. That's how they carry out their abuse, their threats, their intimidation, their violence. Because the pen is used to give them all the power over you, the victim, and over all society. And they can single out anybody they like. They do it to a certain few that they know they have broken the law and they've got crimes to answer for. And their intent then is to totally control the victim's life, own the victim's life, and take it on the path they want to take it and destroy it. And that's what they've done to my life for 20 years, and that's what they're going to pay for. So now it's a question of, am I getting a Royal Commission of Inquiry, or is this going to a last resort? I would say 99% they're going to let this go to a last resort, because they want this to end in a last resort. That's all they've ever wanted, and that's all they've ever worked for. So I want to make sure that these animals, if and when it does end in a last resort, they themselves are held criminally to account by the world leaders for the murders that they're involved in.